So today's is Sheree Josephson. So today's guest is Sheree Josephson, who's been the guest the whole semester, but now she's gonna.
I liked being the guest sitting at the table rather than the one standing up here. So, okay, so yes, I'm Sheree Josephson. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I do with my eye tracking research to study visual imagery on internet. And I'm a what is the phrase? A one-show pony? What's the old one? Yeah, one-trick pony, because eye tracking is the only method I have been using to study this for the last 25 years. I've been dabbling with this, as I call it, for a long time. My dissertation used eye tracking to study newspaper design. You know, it was the early days of USA Today and all the color and the new design, so that was kind of a whiz-bang topic back then, old news literally now. And then I've just kind of done that from here on out. So I've done some academic studies. I'm going to talk to you about a few of them today, the ones that relate to the web. And I've been off on an interesting tangent in the last couple of years because I also enjoy law. And I teach communication law, so this is an odd thing. Visual communication is probably my primary area, academic area, and then communication law. So I've been using eye tracking to study how people look at those photo arrays that they give folks to identify criminal suspects. And so I've run a study that has to do with cross-racial eyewitness identification, and I've studied, now I'm currently finishing a study on sequential versus simultaneous presentation of those pictures. That's a hot topic. And so I've been off a little bit away from this topic for a few years doing that thing. And, but I'm actually working on a study right now with a graduate student that kind of puts me back into this realm, which is fun, and I'll talk about that.
Were you ever asked to be an expert witness, Sheree?
Well, actually, yes.
Okay.
And my son, who's a lawyer, tells me I can make a lot of money, and I probably should figure out how to make a lot of money, because I don't make a lot of money here doing this. But how I got off on this tangent is my dissertation, my committee chair had this former student who went on to be a criminal prosecutor, or he was a defense attorney. And there was a murder at the Woods Cross Motel it's probably been about 10 years ago. And when they constructed the photo lineup and put his client's picture in the lineup, it was a very different picture from the other five in the lineup. I mean, he was wearing a neon yellow, that yellow-green color, which is actually the color that the eye perceives most quickly. The picture looked rather sinister. And so we did an eye tracking study and went into the preliminary hearing. We didn't actually testify in that case outside of the preliminary hearing, but that's how I got off onto this interesting tangent. So it was kind of a weird little thing. It's kind of interesting where these things take you along the way. So I've had a few interesting travels. I do say I dabble in it. It's become a very prevalent research topic or research methodology in recent years. There are eye tracking systems now that are very commercialized and plug and play and easy to use, and the price has dropped dramatically on some of them. I'm hoping to have one of those systems on campus, an eye tracking laboratory, hopefully soon here, getting some promising results. But I've been using an old system. It's still highly accurate. I'll show it to you, okay? And my thing is not, I kind of put this presentation around some numbers. Anybody know what this number is? I'm just going to start with a few numbers. My students don't know numbers this big, not in communication.
Is that trillion?
Yeah, it's 1 trillion. And in 2008, I think it was 2008, Google reported that we had surpassed 1 trillion URLs out on the internet. 1 trillion. And that was 2008. I tried to find some updated figures, and last night I didn't have the time to, I guess, dig deep enough to find that. Google hadn't updated their numbers on the site I was looking at. But 1 trillion URLs, that's pretty crazy. Here's some more numbers. These come from Nielsen in, I think it was April 2012, about website usage. Nielsen reviews or reports these every month, and some of these numbers can vary dramatically. So this is the number in 1 month time. I think it was April 2012. The average person visited 95 different domains, made 65 visits, 2,700 page views, spent an average of 76 seconds on a web page, and a total of 29 hours on the web during a month. And sometimes I see the Nielsen ratings, and they go up to like 65 or 70 hours a week or a month on the web. So those numbers can fluctuate, but I actually think people are spending less time in some respects on the web than they did in some of the early days. These numbers, little teeny numbers, 50 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, or 10 milliseconds. This is the amount of time that some of the researchers that I've looked at have said that designers have to get attention on a web page. So it can be very short. And then here's the stuff that I studied, eye tracking. Let me tell you a little bit about eye movement. Anybody read about eye movement? I didn't put anything on the class. Does anybody know anything about this? Other than seeing the heat maps and stuff that you sometimes see placed over websites. And I'm not a heat map fan, and I can tell you why. We can talk about that later.
The eye doesn't move slowly. It moves jerkily.
Yes, the eye is constantly moving. We really don't have this sensation. The eye moves from 2 to 5 times every second as we take in visual information. And the average fixation then would vary between 200 and 500 milliseconds. So when it averages about what, 1/3 to 1/4 of a second of fixation. And 90% of the time that we are looking at stuff, we are fixating. There's 10% of the time is moved with those really rapid movements between things on a page. And there's, I could talk to you about visual angle and all of that kind of thing, but I'm not going to get that deep today. But so 10% of the time, the eyes are moving really fast to a new location on the page, but 90% of the time, we're fixating. And we are only, anybody guess why the eye has to move so much as it takes in visual information? I didn't put all the physiological slides into my presentation, but the eye has to get directed. The retina needs to be directed. The retina in the fovea needs to get directed very specifically on what is, that you can only look at a tiny piece of the visual field and take in a very small piece of the information, and the eye has to move in order to do that. We get this sensation of this, this room, people around the table, and it's smooth and all of that. And that's largely because of the brain. The brain is kind of filling in all of that information, and because we've taken it all in, and then it's just smoothing it out. So we don't have that jerky sensation, but the eye is moving 2 to 5 times every second. And people sometimes argue about what is the fixation. I'll show you my lovely high-tech system here, that I'm hoping to have updated. But it'll give you, it's a good basic system, and it'll show you what, it doesn't do some of the fancy stuff, but it's good at gathering information. And I was one of, bragging rights, because I don't get any credit for this. So this would have been in the early 80s, mid-80s. The internet was very new when I was starting to do my first eye tracking study on the web. And it was me and a guy at the Poynter Institute, which is a big deal if you know media, the fields of journalism and media. He was running a lot of eye tracking studies with lots of money, full color publications of his results. And I was teaching at Weber State University for publishing my results in dusty academic journals. But he and I were the first 2 people probably in the United States to apply eye tracking research to see literally what is going on in the internet. So, so you never see my name having credit for that. Oops, I think I went way too far. So here's what my system looks like. And actually, to pull this together, I worked with this company called iScan. They're still around. They're in Massachusetts. And they actually were one of the first to kind of develop this technology, but they were using it. They had huge military contracts. They're the folks that do all of the stuff for the F-16s and all of that kind of thing. So to get them to take some time to help this poor new faculty member in the middle of nowhere, Utah, adjust their equipment so that it can look at things. That's what they did for me. So I have this camera that sits by a computer, and we're able to track precisely what a person is looking at using pupil corneal reflection technique. Okay, let me show you a little bit of eye tracking. I didn't put a lot of videos in here because it's hard to see. You're going to see this tiny white crosshair on this video. I don't know if you can see it. I don't know if we can turn out the lights for this part.
Sure.
Is there a light switch by you over there?
You have the clapper?
I wondered, do you?
Install the class.
Technology.
And so this was something I used in one of my studies, and this is a person looking at this page. Okay. You see that little white dot? The video quality I get from this is not very good.
Oh, my God.
But see that little dot that's jumping around? Sometimes you're seeing the cursor, but you're seeing that dot that's moving around. So that's someone.
The cursor. Okay.
See it? Yeah. So it's the one that's jumping all over. And so they found what I told them to find. Okay. All right. That's all the video I have because the quality is not very good from my system. Okay. Just
So
quickly, you can turn the lights back on.
So basically, the eye was jerking all over
Yeah.
And like making,
the field.
I mean, it was making some directional
Yeah.
like shapes, which I think were
And
really
when you
interesting.
like define a fixation versus a saccade, which are the really
Yeah.
quick movements in between the fixations, those are defined by how much, how much of the visual angle has changed and stuff like that. People argue about what is a fixation and what isn't a fixation. And so most people say it has to be at least 100 milliseconds and the eye has to move a certain amount to constitute a fixation. So I've run some studies where I've studied fixations, and then I've run other studies where I've studied what I call the scan path. And sometimes I look at the whole gaze, so it doesn't matter where the fixations are, I'm looking at the gaze pattern. So I get all kinds of data. So just quickly, this is what my lovely old-fashioned system, but I'll show you just all the data that this amounts to. So these are the XY coordinates of where the eye is looking on the screen, the fixation time, the fixation start. I can pull lots of data. They call this the raindrop fixation scan path, so that'll show you the fixations. The size of the circles represents the time. So this was a bigger fixation. This is a teeny length. And so I can get that kind of data.
So can you tell where they went first?
Yeah, sometimes it's hard on these bit because there's a lot of lines, but
Is it the green one?
they ended here. I can't see the beginning one here. And sometimes I trim the data files because to start my study, I'll tell them to look in the middle of the screen. There's a big calibration process that's involved. It's usually doesn't take very long. You have to calibrate the equipment, and so they often are told to look at the middle of the screen first. So I might trim that fixation point depending on what I'm doing. Okay, so I can get that. And then I can get a thing like this, and the colors represent time. Some of these are useful and some aren't, depending on what I'm looking at. One of the ways I do this, because you can do all kinds of things. You can say, how many times did the person fixate in this area? What was the total fixation time in that area? That kind of thing. But one of the things that I and my research partner, who's the director of media, the Ball State Center for Media Design, what we do is we actually study the paths, which takes into account the order that people looked at things. See, the thing that I don't think the heat maps tell us that much anyway. My system doesn't do it. Maybe that's why. But it doesn't show you where they started, the order, how many times they visited things, you know, and the area of the fixation gets, the whole area gets filled out, and they didn't look at the whole thing. And you can't tell, did they look there for a long time because they were interested? Did they look there for a long time because they were confused? It's easier to tease that kind of thing out looking at the scan path. Mm-hmm. And so we do this thing where we actually go through and create this alphabet. They looked at area A and then B and then C and then B and then A and all of this thing. And we do this complex thing where we're able to compare scan paths and actually say, this was the most common scan path. These were the most different scan paths. You know, this is, and we can do we do multi-dimensional scaling. All this stuff's really boring, you know. Cluster analysis and all of those things to kind of figure out what this might be telling us. Mm-hmm. So I'm really interested in the order sometimes in my studies. So my system will allow me to get that. And then, you know, I do this for clients or for research presentations, superimpose it over the image so they can see what was happening. So my system does, you know, bar charts of average fixations on each area of interest, does timelines, and that's about it. But that's a lot of data. You know, if somebody looks at something for 30 seconds, I could have 150 data points. And then so when we've done studies on television and things like that, can you imagine? So you have to be a numbers lover to play with eye tracking data.
Can't you combine them like you get, is that what a hotspot is then? Like,
Pardon?
you get all the little points and can't you combine them and then you have like, you know?
I'm not following, but probably.
Instead of working with 100 little points, I just want one big.
Oh yeah, so sometimes I will say, you know, instead of saying they fixated 3 times in AAA and then BB or CC, I might go A, B, because I only care about the, so you can do that. You just have to make these judgment calls about what you're interested in looking at and analyzing. If I could recall correctly, I've kind of done 7 studies about the web, and I've forgotten some of the findings. This is my first study that was on the web. And I was actually doing some consulting with Intel and Wired. I was involved with putting the first Intel website up. So, and that's actually how I got my eye tracking system, is that Intel, I did a big consulting project for them. And in return, they gave me this eye tracking system that at the time was worth, believe it or not, all that old equipment was probably worth $50,000. So that's how I did a little trade with Intel because I was working with them initially. So when they first began, you can tell this is kind of an early website, putting banner ads on these news sites. Wired magazine, and I was allowed to use this for academic research. We were interested in whether how animation impacted how people looked at the banner ad, whether that would really draw their attention, and whether the placement of the ad, top versus bottom. So I had this study where I had conditions where I had ads on the top, ads on the bottom, animated, not animated, a big thing. And what do you think I found out? Is location of the ad the most important thing in drawing attention to that place on the page, or is location the most important, or are they both equally important? What do you think I found out?
Do you mean location versus animation?
Yeah.
That's what
I would guess animation was more important.
Location.
Location was the strongest variable. People, probably because people are drawn to the top of the page when they read English anyway.
Really? So if
So
something's moving, they're not going to go to where it's...
they would look at it, but it didn't impact it as much as, and other researchers found similar results. And so in the early days when everybody was making this stuff that moved and did all this just because they could, you know, or they thought it would draw attention. Because what happens is, I didn't say this, attention is linked to fixation, which is then linked to cognitive processing. So where people are fixating is the information that they are processing. But so a lot of the other research using other methods was finding similar results. And so I think we saw people eventually cut back on all the fancy moving around stuff that we saw early on the web. They might do some of it, but they were doing it differently. So location in that early study was the most important.
I wonder though if animation is more important now.
Yeah, this is an old study, so
Yeah,
I do not
because
know.
I think we've gotten better at ignoring ads.
Yes.
We
Because,
know
I
what
mean,
they're
you
going to
look
be.
at now most websites have video on them, you know, and so
Or it'll
that's
pop out at you.
Yeah.
So
So they force you to look at it. I
Exactly.
mean, because we have, like we've talked about, somebody used the term in this class, banner blindness. We have educated ourselves over the years to ignore ads or whatever we want to ignore on the web, especially ads. In the early days of the web, people looked at this stuff. They probably spent an average of about 2 seconds on a banner ad like that. That's a lot of time. That's might be 6 to 10 fixations. So they really would get a lot of information in just 2 seconds. But now, I mean, the results I'm seeing for animated ads, I haven't looked for a few months, was, they might not fixate even one time or one time, 0.25 of a second. But sometimes some marketers, that's good enough because you might get that awareness kind of thing from, spending 1/4 of a second looking at something. So, but it's really gone down. And then with the scan path analysis, one of the things that I was really interested in was there was this old theory called the scan path theory by this guy at UC Berkeley. His name was Larry Stark. I don't know if he's around anymore. He was like the foremost expert on eye tracking. I don't know if anybody's ever heard his name. He taught in the medical school there. But he had this theory that the way we remember things, visual information in the brain, wasn't because we just take this snapshot of this image, that the way the brain was storing the information was by the order of the way they looked at things. And then he said that people who would revisit a picture or revisit a website to determine whether they recognized it, they might follow that similar scan path kind of thing, the order that they, the same way of looking at it. Because do you ever have that sensation when you're driving your car and you, in an area that you drive all the time, and then it's like, oh, I didn't know that was there. You had never fixated on it apparently, and suddenly you did, and so the fixation path was changed. But we typically kind of look at the visual scene in a habituated order, is what he would say, and he argued that that's how information gets stored. We're not storing snapshots of pictures in the brain. It's not working like that. And so in the web, I knew that I was using portal pages a lot back in the day. So I might visit, I look at the Weber State website probably 10, 20 times a day as I need to go into the advising screen and all of that. And I probably kind of scan that similarly time after time after time to find the information and do what I need to do with the site. So what we did for this portal page study is we had 3 different portals. We had them look at like an MSN site and just because it had good areas of interest. That Altoids, no, not the Altoid site. Anyway, 3 portal pages. And what they did, they came in, looked at the page, and then they went away for 3 days, came back, looked at the same page. The content had changed, Went away for 3 days, came back, looked at the same page, content had changed. Like a Yahoo, I think Yahoo was one of my portal pages we used. And then we did that string analysis thing and compared all these scan paths. And we found evidence for that old theory, and we've gotten a lot of attention from this. Like we did all this analysis, and these were 3 similar scan paths. And you can see that subject 8, day 2, and subject 8, day 3, their scan paths were statistically similar. And that would happen time after time, especially in those 2, 3, when they visited it for the second and then the 3rd time.
it's interesting there though, because you look, they only scan the top banner the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and this was subject 5, day 1. So, but anyway, we saw this a lot where the scan paths were the most statistically similar. Yeah. So that we've played around with
Sure.
that.
I
Yeah.
have a question. I mean, people visit websites because there's a reason they're doing so.
Right.
You're talking about people just staring at the page. Were they
We would
set
give
up
them-
to investigate something? I mean, because that changes everything.
Yeah,
I thought
it
about the
changes
Weber portal. I look at different things based on what I'm intending to do.
Yeah.
So were these subjects asked to just look at a page?
I mean, and that I think the instructions, we always set it up, contextualize it, and give them the same exact instructions. I can't remember exactly what they were with the portal page. I think it was just as if you would if this were a page that you typically used, to find information, that kind of thing. Like in this study, that used that Altoids page, we were looking at age differences, and in this study we gave them a task. So we would say, find, the sign-up box. Find, I can't remember what it was, something on this page, and find something on this page. And we had 3 different age groups. We had like young adolescents come in and do this. We had more middle-aged people come in and do this, and we had like 65 to 80-year-old people come in and do the same task. Because the theory would probably be that, and it depends on when you run the study too with the web, that maybe older people would have a more difficult time, and their scan paths would be different, they would behave differently. But surprisingly what we found is if the old people's eyes were harder to calibrate, I'll tell you that much. Contacts, glasses, glass eyes, we had some really interesting things. But we found that there were few age differences when internet usage was the same in the search task there. That was a fun one. We didn't do too much with that one. And then here's my one and only typography study. And I didn't do that much with this because you really have to have your system calibrated accurately to pick up fixation on reading of the small text. But what happened in this case, I knew this guy who was this editor of this academic journal, and they were doing a special issue on typography. I didn't know, I don't usually study typography, I'm too busy. He called me and he said, "We would love to have you run a study on typography. It would really round out this issue." This doesn't happen with academic journals. I loved it. This issue of this journal. Could you please do this by 2 weeks? Literally, 2 weeks I did this study. So I only had like 10 subjects, and I was like, oh, I can't remember all my results sometimes. But we had participants come in, and we had 2 type fonts that were designed specifically for the web. I think it was Georgia and Verdana. One was a sans serif type and one was a serif type. And then we had 2 typefaces that we looked at, sans serif and serif typeface, that were most widely used in the print world. And we created a study where we did some comparisons. And in this limited amount of time, it was crazy, basically the one major finding that we saw is that people made they were able to read them almost as quickly and as easily, but they really preferred the sans serif typefaces if it came to it on the web. At that point in time, I know things have improved. But the one other thing that would happen too is we found more what are called regressions when people looked at the typefaces that were designed for print, meaning they had to go back more to take in the information when they were looking at the type fonts that were designed for print and not specifically for the web. So that was kind of interesting that they were getting through it, but they also they had preference differences, obviously. And on the web, they typically preferred the sans serif in the reading text. And then I've studied television news design. What am I on time? How this study came about is I was told to go on sabbatical leave by the dean and stop advising this signpost and concentrate on my academic work and get tenure and promotion. And so on 2001, September 2001, I started a year-long sabbatical leave. And I had all these consulting projects set up and all of this stuff going on. Well, September's my favorite time of the year, so obviously I'm not working too much yet. I'm hiking and reading in the sun and doing everything but my work. But I had stuff lined up. Well, on September 11th, 2001, lying in bed, sleeping in, this is my sabbatical, husband taking care of the kids, my daughter burst into the room and said, "The president, why is the president on all of the stations?" So I bolted out of bed, former journalist, what is going on? And turned on the TV to see all of this unfold before my very eyes. So most of my consulting projects fell apart because of September 11th. They were in New York City, it impacted the economy. But what I ended up doing I probably didn't even take a shower for 3 days. I just sat in the bed and watched TV with the clicker, station to station to station, trying to find out what was going on, get any new piece of information. And I didn't have cable at the time, so I hadn't seen the whole cable news presentation. I was just used to the screen, kind of similar to this, where they're telling me the news. And on September 11th, even the networks, split screen, on background, crawler, headlines moving in and out, logos, patriotic backgrounds. I mean, the screen was suddenly filled with information, and I wasn't used to looking at the screen that way. And so what would happen to me is I would say, "Oh, I'm going to stay on this station, and that sounds like a great interview." And then what I must have done was sat there and read the crawler, because that was moving. And by the time I'd read the same thing about 3 times, it would hit me, oh, and I'd miss the interview sometimes. And so that became an interesting question to me. And so my research partner and I put together a study where we had these 3 conditions that we made, just the plain screen. We had all these conditions, just the crawler with changing out headlines that relate to what the person is saying, and we studied that. And how the information is displayed on television screen really impacted how people looked at information. There's a whole interesting theory called dual processing theory and all of that in cognitive psychology that relates to this. So we did that. So I would sit right here oftentimes, wait for that information to crawl through. And actually, after the study was published, we were contacted by CNN, who, has this crazy busy kind of news layout. And they actually told us that based on our research, they were going to change how they display the crawler.
Wow.
So you see now that CNN, instead of MSNBC still runs that, and some of those other stations, that information across the crawler. CNN will kind of put the headline in, give it a few seconds, change it, leave it there for a minute, change it. We haven't done any eye tracking since they've changed it, but their thinking is that people would look at this and be able to come back up here, as opposed to just wait all the time for the next letters to scroll across the screen. Mm-hmm. So we did that, which is kind of fun. And then this is a more recent one that I did at Ball State University with a different system. And those second screen applications that go along with the TV news shows? You know what I mean? I'm a big Grey's Anatomy fan, so I noticed that Grey's Anatomy had a second screen application so that when you were watching the show, things were happening on your iPad that related to the show. So there was social television watching. You could interact with other people who were watching the TV, the same show. They would have contests and quizzes, and they're doing that kind of thing because people aren't watching television and staying there like we used to do in the olden days and just get up and down for, I do it too now. I record everything, I zip through the ads. So they're thinking that if there's interesting content that's being pushed to the television viewer, they'll stay engaged. And then they can also advertise here and advertise there. And so we did a study. And in this little study that we did, so we had 60 minutes of eye tracking data
Wow.
and these 2 screens that we looked at, and how that changes the television viewing environment. And people typically, this is what the other studies are showing too, divert about 30% of their attention to the small screen and 70% out here. And it actually changes the length of gaze and all kinds of things when you add in another screen. But the screen, you know, what I want to do now, because we all watch TV with more than 2 screens sometimes. I'll have my phone, my laptop, my television set. I mean, and how do you design a website for that? And then this is the last one that we're working on now. I'm working with a student who's a Salt Lake Tribune reporter, former editor-in-chief of the Signpost, and she's interested in whether the way we present information in different social media platforms impacts how much people pay attention to it and whether they go to the news story. So her working hypothesis is, I don't know if you guys follow news on Facebook or Twitter, but that Facebook questions, maybe more cutesy things work in Facebook, and maybe in Twitter, those aren't as effective. Those straight news, hard news, summary headlines might be better. And she's telling me that that seems to be the early findings. So that's kind of what we're playing around with now. And then I have some tips about some just things I think I've learned about web page design from my studies and observations. I don't know, tell me what you think of these. First impressions. All the research that I've looked at say that these are definitely driven by the visual appeal of a website. Visual impressions. What do you think about that? I see people nodding. I'll just go through these quickly when we come back. And I think designers need to think about how people are going to flow through the information on the site. That's really important. I'll tell you a little story. When I was doing some consulting with a big ad agency in Salt Lake City, they decided to implement, we had a research lab set up at this ad agency, and they decided they were going to require everything, every website, every web page that rolled out of their place was going to be tested by eye tracking first. Now, they were testing things during the design process, and they were definitely testing it before they were sending it out. So clients put this big, tech companies love this big edict down saying all information will be run through the eye tracker just to make sure people are seeing our logo and getting our message and blah, blah, blah. The creatives, the art directors freaked out. They freaked out. There was like, they freaked out. I can remember that day. And then what happened as time went along, they loved it. Because what they discovered is some of this out-of-the-box stuff, different ways of putting information on a new screen, was effective, was working. And now they had a thing that they could show the client to say, this design does work on the screen. And so these creatives were just coming constantly to have their material checked. It was really fun. I kind of mentioned this one. I think screen design, you can do a lot of different things on the screen and can page that work. Navigation, you do see this in the heat path, the heat maps dramatically. You know, that navigation is often the first thing and the main thing that people look at, and that's why you often see those F things, because that's nav that they're looking at. Navigation, major content. It's kind of what they're doing. Photography. And Pointer's research has kind of found this out too, that at least in news settings maybe, and stuff that I look at, that photographs might not be as important on the screen as they are in print. They're important, but they might not be as important. And people don't spend that much time looking at them as much as they seem to do in print. Usability and interactivity obviously can't be ignored. people have talked about this, white space and clutter, you have to manage that kind of stuff. Think about it. Page load time. I think people tend to be, we're all impatient, especially when it was taking longer for pages to load, but people are more patient. They'll give you a little bit if the page is visually appealing. And they'll wait a second longer or a fraction of a second longer if it works. Some of the studies have shown that what the experts, those of us who maybe are so-called experts around the table about design, that some of the stuff might not line up with what some of the users will tell us is good on the web.
Don't tell your students. Just know your audience.
Yeah.
Know your audience.
And then finally, if you can, and there are other ways besides eye tracking, obviously, you ought to test website design with actual users. And I think I just had 2 more slides. A little push for my book that's probably sold 50 copies. I did a book for Peter Lang. I was the main editor and contributor of this book that's been out about a year and a half, called Visualizing the Web. It's an edited edition, and people look at website design from other visual communication perspectives. And I looked on Amazon yesterday, and I think I was at one point at 200,000 in the Amazon sales thing. I'm down to 5 million and something, so that's pretty funny. Here's my book, and change. And then because I'm an old print journalist at heart, my final number, we used to put a 30 at the end of a news story to tell the typesetters that we were done. Thank you. So, comments, that's what I have. I always have the driest. So that's a little bit of eye tracking, a little bit I've done with it.
So you haven't done any other testing but eye tracking, or have you worked with other ones as well?
Just related testing that goes with eye tracking. I've done, the surveys and the observation, but mostly it's the eye tracking data with me that people seem to be interested in. So I mostly do the quantitative stuff. Jacob Nielsen, he's been mentioned around this table. If you go to his, I think it's called useit.com or something, his website, I had a little fun interaction with Jacob Nielsen at a big website design conference. It's probably 15 years ago or something. I was presenting on website, or eye tracking on websites, and he at that point in time was just doing observational research where he'd go in and watch how people use the computer in a natural setting kind of stuff. That's mostly what he was doing. And he came up to me, we literally had this raised voice discussion. He basically told me that the eye tracking data was phooey kind of a thing, and guess what now? Look at his website. He's all about eye tracking. Just, he was telling me, you can't know this, you can't learn this, and now most of what he does to talk about website usability and design is based, at least in some part, in eye tracking. Lots of people are doing this now, unfortunately in a way, because it's becoming harder and harder for me to get my stuff published. When you were the only one.
Right.
There's this ACM, everybody around this table probably understands, Association for Computing Machinery, is that what it's called? And they have, it's been about 10, 12 years ago, they have a division called ETRA, Eye Tracking Research and Applications, and they have this big international conference every 2 years, and it's getting harder and harder and harder. To get into that conference now, it's about probably less than 20% acceptance, and people come from all over the world. People are especially active in eye tracking research in Finland, and in fact, we have a story. One of the people that I met at a conference, her name escapes me right now, but she's from the University of...
Tampere.
Huh?
Tampere.
Okay, she's from that university that Dave knows because of his wife Marjuka, and didn't you actually see the eye tracking, her
No,
eye
I
tracking
talked
lab,
there
or talked to her?
Yeah, I talked to
And
her.
so I had talked to them. Haven't seen her for a couple of years, so that was kind of a coincidence that you know, small world of eye tracking, I guess. But Asia, they're doing a lot of it. Now I get emails from students, grad students in Hong Kong or whatever. They'll say, "I read your paper and blah blah blah." And I was like, "Yes, someone read that paper." One person. So it's kind of fun.
Sheree, does any of this research monitor what the user eventually clicks on? Because, again,
It can.
is there a correlation between iPath and what they eventually decide to do?
Probably. I haven't been able to do that because my system doesn't scroll or allow me to have the user click.
Okay.
But others have studied that, and
Because I would think that's the ultimate purpose of the
Right.
page, is to
but you know,
guide the user.
marketers
inform them.
and you know people who make messages anymore, they don't talk so much about. I mean, they talk about click-through rate, which is really easy that data to gather. But you know, just because it has little or no click-through rate doesn't mean it hasn't been that the person hasn't perceived and might not and won't remember the message. Because if they fixated on it just a couple of times, you know, the message has probably been perceived at a certain level. So, but my system, that's one of the things I need to be able to do, is have a system where people can click and scroll. So I have that limitation with my old system.
I'm just saying the foundation of the web is hyperlinking,
Yeah.
so that's the connectivity between one page and
And
another.
so that would be really
makes the web
fun
what
to
it is.
study that. So keep your fingers crossed for me. And maybe
And
we'll
so
put
it
this
would be-
funding together.
It would be interesting to find out, like, what is there one place on the website where they always leave?
Where they always lead?
Yeah, so like, is that because of maybe time to load, or is it because of content is boring, is it because?
Well, I think they generally leave the page with the stuff that I've observed and seen in my research and others, is they'll obviously get down to that the bottom right,
corner?
and then leave from there. And a lot of times that's why marketers will put their logo and their parting message right there in print or on the screen, because somehow they'll come through the information in an S or a Z pattern and leave the web page. In print, we talk about the Z pattern.
Right.
Sometimes I've seen people talk about an S pattern, primarily a Z. If you look at most advertising in print, especially, you can often see this.
Does that apply to web?
And
Do you do that in
I
web?
think this applies to the web, and then they might come down and off.
Again, when you read a New York Times article, that probably happens on other sites too, when you get near the bottom of the article, they'll often prompt you with another article.
Mhm.
You'll see that thing on the lower right.
Yeah, so that lower right's a really important location.
But it is an interesting place, like if you were a drug company and you're trying to, you know how when you see a TV ad, like a Lunesta commercial, it's like I never want to buy Lunesta because like in the background they're talking about all the side effects, right? It doesn't seem like a successful ad. On the screen, you have to probably present that information too. So you probably want to know where users don't put it on the screen so that you can put all the information there. It should require to put by law.
Yeah.
Where is that located?
Yeah.
Or,
And there's that compounding factor that's hard to deal with if there's audio that's happening at the same time. It just gets so complicated
Right.
to try to.
Right. What I think is really interesting about your research, because I do user testing studies, which are more ethnographic, and users can't always tell you
No.
what they are actually doing, and this
They
physiological part of
absolutely
it is so
cannot
interesting.
tell you because the eye is moving so quickly,
Right, and they
the
don't even
research is
know.
actually, and they
Yeah.
don't even know. And the research has actually showed that people cannot accurately explain to you how they have looked or how they are looking at some information on a screen. This doesn't correlate very strongly,
Right.
if at all. So it's kind of surprising that people can't figure that out.
But I figure I know how I look at the Weaver State website, and see, that's why I have a hard time with this idea that animation, you don't go, and also the images. Because when it comes to Weaver State, I go to the animation because it's what's changed.
Yeah.
It's gonna have
Yeah,
the
novelty.
new
The
information.
research does show that the new information
And
is
then a
what
lot of
people
times it's not so
fixate.
much ads that are in that animation, there's photos that are being updated and.
Or if there's something unusual, in a picture or that kind of thing, that would be what will draw the attention. So
I think-
new and novel,
Uh-huh.
really
so-
important, right?
Or I think also personal connections, like if you are drawn to something because of
Yeah.
your own memories or your own thought process. It's interesting.
Yeah, and people look at, every individual differences, everybody does it differently. You might think there's some similarities. Like the cool thing about the scan path analysis is we could say this is the central scan path. This might be more typical, it's kind of like the median, you know? And this is typically, and that might be, if you're working with a client, what you'd run in and say, this is typically how people seem to be looking at this information. But then there's all the people who looked at it, and everybody looked at it in a different way. But then what's interesting, like in that portal page study, is that within individuals, when they return to an image or return to a website, they might travel it in a similar fashion, revisit it in a similar way.
Have you done any research and taking a look at sites that people are very accustomed to? So they've been regular visitors for more than a year, and seeing how they're processing new information on that site, or if they're just completely tuning everything out that they know they don't need to look at and just going directly to the.
I did not study that per se, but I'm sure there's probably research out there where people have with eye tracking. Starting to be a lot of articles published.
Because it would be interesting to see what we habituate to.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people spend time with the navigation, it's always in the same place because it's a convention, so part of that's learned too. So
Yeah, and the
that'd be
middle of the
interesting.
screen is really important. You know,
But,
people,
you know,
I haven't teased that out, but when you look at the scan, that middle part probably would get crossed over a lot of times.
But if we're going by what's been mentioned about now, the design is vertical, it'd be interesting to see, well, how many get to the bottom of the page? You know, are they actually skipping what you have to scroll down to?
Yeah, based
Like,
on
are they going to links
some
and
of
getting
the
out of
stuff
there,
that
or are
we
they
showed.
actually really scrolling down?
Like he showed some really beautiful websites during his presentation, and as he was doing, I was thinking it would be really interesting if I had a system where I could scroll and click, but you could design a beautiful site where you could scroll, and then you could somehow design it in a slightly different way where you had to click and do some sort of comparison. I thought that, I was like, maybe that's my next study.
I could see a lot of value in the data that you get back to prove which design is working and which isn't. How accessible is it to do the scanning on websites? Would it be more efficient to get your own equipment and do it yourself, or would you outsource it to someone?
Well, I think like Nielsen and the other Nielsens, those guys, people charge, it's expensive research. Nielsen Media just opened, well, it's been probably a year ago, this beautiful facility in Manhattan, and they have a big eye tracking lab, and they probably charge people a lot. But the systems now, you can buy, there's kind of systems that run from like $1,500 to the one I'd really like is probably $50,000, $60,000, made by a company called Toby. But some of the $10,000 systems, which is the one that I'm hoping to maybe bring to campus, looks, from what I've seen in a conference, you really get a lot for your money. So it would be a good investment. And with this system that's our personal system, my husband and I, mostly my husband for a while, had a consulting business where he did eye tracking research. Not a lot of people do it, more now. Price probably has come down. But with these new systems, you can do quick and dirty, which is what I call it, research, pretty easily. Like you could instantly show them the scan path. You could instantly show them a heat map, but you can't, to do an analysis takes time, but you could do that almost on the fly. And that's what we were doing at that ad agency. We were doing it on the fly. We'd grab people, 6, 8 people off the street, bring them in, have them look at some stuff, take that to the client the next day, or to the creative meeting, and have discussion about what we thought was happening with that design. Folks are using it. I've been involved in one consulting project in web and game design. So, to try to make it hard, I'm not a gamer, but, to test what would they be called, like the storyboard kind of things that are on the computer before they, flesh it all out. So, game development companies are using eye tracking to figure out how to do this. It's probably not cheap. You could do it cheaper. You buy a $10,000 system if that's what you want, and then you just kind of do it on your own. Because now it's pretty easy. Calibration's almost, because I have to have people, and the auto calibration does this too. I didn't show you all this, have these dots, so that you can get the calibration lined up before you can show them the content you want them to look at. The tricky thing is, and this thing is that time, the web changes, and it seems like if I have to spend a year or 2 years on a study,
Right.
by the time I'm
Yeah.
having time to write about it, it's like the web's a different thing,
Right.
and so that's a challenge.
But you wonder if, like this startup lab that we're doing downtown, if there was some sort of an easy way for people to get, snapshots essentially of their
Mhm.
screen and some kind of feedback
Yeah,
in
you could
terms
get
of how
that on the fly now with
That'd
these
be
new
really cool.
systems. Yeah.
and maybe there's a way to interact virtually with some sort of consulting aspect or something. I don't know. I mean, I've often wondered if it made sense to do something, up here between our two colleges in terms of some sort of usability lab. And of course, eye gaze is what we focused on, but it's not the most prevalent, right? I mean, there's, you've mentioned interview and observation and environmental observation and group artistic, critique, whatever. I mean, there's lots of ways to sort of take a website to see how effective it is.
I think that'd be really cool for Weber State because I can't think of any other schools in Utah or anywhere near that do that. I think that could be a good draw.
Actually,
Weber State.
BYU has a eye tracking lab
Do
in
they?
their communication department, from what I understand from a grad student of ours who went down there. I don't know how much they do with it. It's one of those things that can easily get shut in a closet if some people aren't using it.
I like the idea of doing something broader, like that you
Right.
mentioned, kind of a
Usability.
usability lab. I
Yeah.
think that could be
I think
something
that's
really cool.
Anybody got an extra space we can put that?
I have a little closet type office, which is where I put my stuff now.
I've seen some really nice labs. I mean, you've got the mirrors and the cameras everywhere. And all
Well,
that
my
kind of stuff.
research partner has that lab. They have that
At
lab
Ball?
on campus, and then they have that lab in New York City, actually. And they have that head-mounted system. I'm not a huge fan of the head-mounted system because that seems more obtrusive to me
Right.
than a camera. And now the camera can kind of be just like under your computer. You don't have it sitting here. And they had a lot of calibration problems between the two screens. So sometimes these fancy systems aren't as easy to maneuver as. So they've kind of used it and then put it in a closet at the moment too, I think. So that happens. A lot of universities have the capability, but if people aren't using it or they have a bad day in the office and can't calibrate it, they just like throw it in there, I'll never to look at it again. But it would be a cool thing. I mean, eye tracking, what's really cool is this, there's so many applications. I was just reading an article about, this has been happening for a lot of years at Yale, using it to try to understand information processing with autistic children. Like sometimes I watch these things and sometimes I have students as participants and I'll know who's a great student and who's a struggling student. And you can sometimes kind of see it in how the eye behaves on the screen. I mean, some people's eyes don't land, if you will, and and I'm like, oh, no wonder that person has reading problems or comprehension problems. And sometimes I have to wonder if there's a way to train people to, properly make fixations and saccades, and maybe that could, that's what they're kind of dealing with the autistic crowd.
What kind of inferences can you, I mean, into that, because you mentioned that you've done that quick study on sort of looking at different fonts and how people read different fonts, and that in some contexts people did more backtracking, although that wasn't a term you used. And what inferences can we draw? I mean, it is a behavior difference, but what, can we draw inferences from that? I mean, backtracking might be a sign that you're not comprehending. It could also mean that you're looking for deeper content than
Right.
someone who's just going forward. So
And see, sometimes that's why I would, after I run the eye tracking study, have some questions, and they might be on the spur based on what I observed as I did the eye tracking, or I might have a set of questions and see in-depth interviews, or because it is really kind of hard to tease out whether people did something for a good reason or a not good reason, sometimes by what's happening. Because yeah, maybe they're backtracking because they are thinking and processing it at a deeper level.
Right, or maybe trying to see whether there's coherence between
Right.
or contradictions between. And that's one of the, the virtues of written culture as opposed to oral culture. This is what Walter Ong says, is that with text, we have the capacity to backtrack and to see whether there's coherence in arguments in the way that we can't as easily with oral argument because we're always fixated on moving forward.
And sometimes what I was considering a regression was just kind of within the word or really close as opposed to going back and reading the whole thought again. So from that I inferred that it might have to do with the display of the type, and that's how regression was defined. So, going back and rereading and reading it
Backtracking
slowly.
in the word is...
I like it, that's the word I kind of use.
I really like this word. Let me look at this.
Right. And fonts would make sense for making differences in that, because since we do see shapes,
Yeah.
and the shapes between serifs and sans serifs can really be so different. It's
And
interesting.
all the research about the all caps and that kind of thing
Right.
originally comes out of the
Right.
reading studies, using eye tracking. So it's fun. I don't get a lot of time really to do it. It's kind of my summer hobby.
It doesn't, you don't have this in any of your classes or anything. This is totally,
And in fact, here's the irony in all of this. I consider myself a visual comms scholar, and we have a graphic design only class we have in our curriculum. I've taught it once in 19 years that has to do with anything visual. I end up teaching research methods and everything but visual.
Research is a good outlet, and we need to get back into that
A little
when you
bit.
can.
Yeah.
well, that's good. Anybody else have any questions? Or?
Thank you so much for
So
sharing.
that's,
Yeah,
that's
thanks for
my
sharing.
odd, my friends go to the gym or the eye tracking lab.
This is
story,
fascinating.
Oh my.
Story of my life.
And I don't
What's
think
your hobbies?
communication person is being so quantitative, so I had to laugh when you
I am so,
saw the
I was a math
downer.
major for a while as an undergrad. I am very quantitative, very linear, logical,
Interesting.
qualitative stuff.
I still don't believe that people don't look at pictures and websites.
They
You don't-
look
you
at
don't
them.
have me on that one yet.
Well, in news sites, they look at them, but they don't look at them as much as you would think they look at them.
Yeah.
They might spend a couple of
That's just
fixations,
really
but then
funny.
they're gonna read the text.
When we do that, we intentionally make pictures like not the focus. It's the text that's the focus. And so we do lots of blurs on the picture, so it just kind of blurs it out. So it's just a background,
But you talked about how one picture made all the difference.
Yeah, but it's
You know?
but it's still they're not focusing on the picture. It's just the aesthetics of everything.
Yeah.
All right.
And
You
we
know,
can quickly
we're putting
decide
it
what we
behind,
think
and it looks
about a
prettier,
picture, yeah.
but they're not looking at the
Right.
picture.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
really interesting. I was wondering about that too. Like, does the picture just end up breaking up the space in a way where it feels more comfortable to read the text?
Yeah.
So
I think
it's
it
just,
gives cues about the qualities of what you're looking at in a way that you can grab really quick. And that it adds to it. It's another part of it, but yeah, it's not necessarily the focus.
Yeah.
Like when I used
So-
to design broadsheet newspaper pages, we'd always devote probably a third or a fourth of the space to pictures and, visual stuff. But I think it's all visual. But, pictures and illustrations and that kind of thing. And that you had to do in print or, at least in a news setting where people didn't want to look at it.
So in a
or
sense,
it was
yeah.
more important.
you'd
breaks
have to
it up.
you'd have to get what that picture's doing out of something other than eye gaze potentially to really understand how, and the selection of picture and how fuzzy it is or whatever, how
Right.
how reflective of the article or whatever it is. That's really interesting.
It really shows you how important stuff like headlines and bullets and links and all of that kind of stuff is, those, as opposed to the text and the pictures. That's really critical. And the eye tracking is really fun to watch. It's just right all over that kind of stuff.
So some of the, this is a lot of the best read sites that you guys were sort of highlighting. I remember at least one of us, a picture of some person. So, were those background images then? Or
No,
was it text?
Usually, yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
It kind of, I mean, it just depends on the site. Like Facebook doesn't have any background images.
Yeah.
Works for
Yeah.
them, so.
Well, it's because you want to look at the other images your
Right.
friends are posting,
Uh-huh.
and that's the
Yeah.
focus.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. Somebody else I saw acted like they were going to say something.
Have you noticed that amount of graphics has increased over time,
In print or on the web?
either in print or web, or both?
Yeah, I would say, the visuals and the headlines and the pullouts and the quote blocks and all that stuff, yeah, we're having to have more points of interest. I think people are so busy, we have to use numerous devices within a single page or a single screen to draw their attention, or else they're quickly off to the next thing. That 50 milliseconds thing, or 10 milliseconds, that's how long people say that it takes to make a decision about whether to go to the next thing.
Yeah.
They might have to stay on it longer to get rid of it, but they make that decision that quickly.
The amount of images increased significantly too, just because of bandwidth. You know, before that was the issue, is
Yeah.
that, you know, the internet wasn't fast enough. But and video is going to be the new thing. It already is starting a lot. They use video as background images. Like, I want to.
Boy, you ought to try to do the eye tracking with the video, which is what I did in my cross-racial eyewitness. Because I show them a video of a crime being committed, and then I bring them back and show them the lineups. It's really complicated to analyze the eye tracking data from a moving image. But it's really fun, you kind of see people just stay right on the eyes, or whatever. And you see cultural differences too in how people look at faces. That's what the cross-racial study showed in that criminal setup, about where on the face that people look for information about how to identify people. The width of the nose or the color of the hair, and between races, people find more information in different places. And that's pretty interesting to watch the facial recognition stuff. Cool.
I find video distracting on the internet and I don't like it. The news sources that now have video features, I don't want to watch a video. I want to scan the text, and that's easy for me to do. If there's images there, that's okay with me, but I find it very annoying when there's something and I don't know it's a video, when I am looking at it and then it turns out to be a video.
A lot of times, it's still just use it as a background. It's still just, you're not supposed to focus on it. Like really clicking through that. There's a video going in the background, but you're not focusing on it. It's just something very subtle that they'll do.
Yeah.
Let's see.
But then again, that's got that little bit of motion that
Yeah.
you're supposed to, I think,
Yeah.
to
But you're focusing
focus
on the
it.
text, that's like the goal, so it just looks cool.
That's great.
Although I would guesstimate that depending on what's happening in that video, that's going to change that eye path, because when those white areas, those high contrast areas start popping up, I'll bet you would see people reading your headline and then jumping back down and then coming back up and then,
Yeah.
oh, there's a face.
And
And
seeing
that,
people walk by.
yeah, and you might be surprised,
Yeah. This company, they're actually probably the best design firm I've ever, heard of. They're based actually in Toronto. They do, they're like, our goal is to be like them. And they're huge. Every one of their projects is, $1 million projects. But yeah, they.
See, I would love to study that in a news setting too, with those news sets and all that stuff that's happening in the background.
Right.
In a natural setting, sometimes I have to wonder, how they flip up all the pictures and they're just thinking it's background. I'm like, I wonder what that's doing to the eye path and the amount of information that people are able to remember, recall when they're thinking, they're getting attention, it looks pretty, and we can do it, so let's do it. But what is that doing to the person?
What was that company, Matt?
T-Hand Wax is what they're called. They're really cool.
Where are they out of?
They're out of Toronto.
Lots of
Canada.
great stuff's happening in
Yeah,
Toronto right
it's
now.
they're really cool.
Huh. T-Pen?
Yeah, T-Hand Wax. Yeah. Just remember that Spotify one that I showed you?
Yeah.
Don't worry, what it was.
Yeah, that would be fun on to iTrack with some of the video in the background.
Yeah.
I'm guessing all those high contrast areas would cause the eye to jump out of that text.
But the simplicity of the rest of the site, actually, there's not so much that
Right.
you're scanning that,
There
yeah,
is.
in some ways it might work.
Yeah.
They'd probably remember it, but it would just
There's
change that.
There's another cool
This
one.
one's really cool. This is
This is,
Spotify.
yeah, Spotify.
Yeah.
And they have a video in the background that it's just still like.
I'm on the guest network, so it's,
Choking a little.
yeah, you can kind of get the idea.
Huh, interesting.
That one's really cool.
Yeah, that one's really,
The
and I
values
probably
of
why
it.
it's working maybe better is the.
Yeah.
It's only a one-liner.
Yeah.
Where'd you get that link?
Spotify.com. I did it incognito though. Take off the US, but anyway.
Yeah, and my eye tracking stuff is all with the web for a couple of years because I've been off on the other tangent.
Oh, research.
Oh, research.
Well, thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Sheree.
Thanks,
That's great.
Sheree.
Thanks.
Very nice. Next week, Ben?
Next week is Ben?
All right.
Alright. I built this. Go back to my faculty candidate. Speaking of interruptions and back and forth.
Yeah, I had to run some more